Hi, everyone. I'm aware it's been a while. I've been rather depressed, without money, without food, but I'm doing my best. We'll be getting back to the SCP content soon enough, but I feel like I want to come back with some real foundation knowledge. You know, the CIA. Another three-letter agency that is also secretive, right? I feel like this book that they've written can be just as useful as any SCP document is in enlightening us. So with that said, I hope you enjoy this video, or well, this reading. The Nature of Psychological Warfare. Preface. The need for manuals for use and training of personnel for psychological warfare operations was discussed in several interested agencies in the spring of 1951. Several other major requirements for research needed in relation to psychological warfare were considered at the time. A conference held at the Human Resources Research Institute of the Air University at Maxwell Air Force Base at that time was the occasion for initial consideration of ways and means of providing for these needs. The Office of the Chief of Psychological Warfare of the Army took an active interest in the problems presented, and in the upshot it was agreed that the Operations Research Office should undertake to play the coordinating role and provide major effort for the provision of training manuals, while some other projects were undertaken by other agencies. The preparation of training manuals is not an ordinary or normal task for an operations research agency. The Operations Research Office would not regard the preparation of such manuals on military subjects in general as part of its proper mission for the Army. At the time in question, however, it was a fact that the small staff engaged in operations research in psychological warfare in the Operations Research Office was the only such staff available to undertake such a task. It was also a fact that the lack of such training manuals as were desired reflected the lack of organization of knowledge and theory of psychological warfare, which was a hampering circumstance for operations research in the subject, as well as for planning and operations in the same connection. The preparation of a training manual presents a number of problems that permit no direct and precise scientific solution. At what level of knowledge and intelligence and interest on the part of the student should the text be aimed? How far should the text take sides in matters on which leading experts are in controversy? How far should the beginning student, whatever level is assumed, be led into the technical refinements of the problem in an initial course study? How far should they be made an expert themselves, or how far should it be assumed that they will be subject to varied assignments of which psychological warfare may be only one, and a temporary one at that? We will not claim pretentious certainty concerning the assumptions we have made as to the answers to these questions. We have tried to prepare what amounts to an intelligent and intelligible text for students of college caliber who do not have previous serious background in the subject and who are not embarking on professional careers or seeking graduate degrees in this particular field. It should also be mentioned that we have no illusion that the present text can stand, or should stand, as too good to be improved. It should serve especially as a focus for critical consideration of what such a text should be, of how it can be improved, of tests as to its adequacy, and of improved versions based on further experience. This volume is one of 3 that were undertaken at the start of the program 2 years ago. It is meant as a general introduction to the principles and practice of psychological warfare. The second volume will be concerned primarily with the media of communication, leaflets, radio, etc., and the third will constitute a casebook of practical examples of psychological warfare techniques. Chevy Chase, MD, May 1953. Part 1. What Psychological Warfare Is. Chapter 1. Introduction to Psychological Warfare. Psychological warfare is one of the means nations use to promote their policies and objectives vis-a-vis the outside world. Nations have been waging it ever since there have been nations, although psychological warfare does happen to be a new name for it. But it has only recently come to be regarded as a distinct government activity that ought to be performed by specially trained professionals. Perhaps the most effective way to give an overall view of psychological warfare is to sketch it briefly in action in ancient and modern times, relate it to communication theory, then define it and its terminology, classify it by missions and apparent source, and finally, relate it to policy and command. Psychological warfare in other times. History and literature are full of examples of the use of psychological warfare, or, more briefly, Psy-War, many of them dating back to a long time before the term itself came into use. One of the earliest literary accounts of the use of Psy-War is found in Homer's Iliad. Troy, a stoutly defended walled city, had been besieged for years by a seaborne invasion army from Greece. The two enemies had reached a stalemate. Many of the heroes on both sides had fallen. When the impasse seemed unbreakable, the Greeks hit upon a stratagem. They built a huge wooden horse and placed it before the gates of Troy. Then they boarded their ships and sailed away, ostensibly for Greece. The Trojans supposed that the Greeks had given up the siege and had left the horse as a gift of peace. With wild rejoicing, they opened the gates of the city, as the Greeks had guessed they would, and brought the horse inside to be the center of a victory celebration. When the party was over, and the Trojans were sleeping it off, the Greek troops who were hiding in the horse came out, for the horse had been made hollow, and big enough to hold a group of men. They came out of hiding and opened the gates of the city to the Greek army, which had sailed stealthily back by night. The Greeks won a complete victory. Trojan horse is still used today to indicate a deception, and beware the Greeks bearing gifts has been a common adage for 2,500 years. Today, as in the days of Hector and Achilles, military commanders still use the Psy-War of display or planned deception. Probably as old as the story of the Trojan horse is the biblical account of Gideon's use of Psy-War in his successful defense of Jerusalem against the vastly superior forces of the invading Midianites. Gideon was aware that his army would be overwhelmed if he were to commit it to open battle with the enemy. He therefore picked 300 men and equipped each with a trumpet and torch, an earthen pitcher being placed over each of the torches to conceal its light until the appropriate moment. Under cover of darkness, Gideon placed his small force in a circle around the enemy. At midnight, when the Midianite guard was being changed, Gideon ordered the pitchers smashed to expose the lighted torches. At the same time, each of the 300 sounded his trumpet. Aroused from their sleep and believing themselves under attack, the Midianites fell into panic and fought with each other in the darkness. The survivors fled in confusion and were hunted down at will by the Jews. This use of deliberately induced panic is perhaps the earliest in recorded history. In China, the Emperor Wang Mang, when he was trying to put down some rebels, collected all the animals from the imperial menagerie and took them along in the hopes that they would intimidate the enemy. The rebels attacked first, however, and in the excitement of battle, the animals got loose and panicked Wang's own troops. Wang thus became the victim of one of the communist techniques of Psy-War, namely that of depressing and unnerving the enemy commander. Note by Rezi, when this document mentions communist, they mean not American, as these people do not understand what the word communist means. Says Paul Linebarger, it undermined his health. He drank to excess, ate nothing but oysters, and let everything happen by chance. Unable to stretch out, he slept sitting on a bench. The incident also serves as a reminder of how Psy-War sometimes boomerangs. Temujin, the Genghis Khan, is commonly believed to have achieved his conquests with limitless hordes of wild Tatar horsemen who overran the world by sheer weight of numbers. It now seems certain, however, that the sparsely settled countryside of Inner Asia could not possibly have produced such hordes. The empire of the Khan was conquered by bold military inventiveness plus the application of Psy-War in many forms. The Mongols used rumor, display, and other Psy-War techniques to increase their reputation for numbers and ferocity, and thus frighten their enemies. Even today, historians still fail to appreciate the lightness of the forces, the resourcefulness of command, and the military Psy-War genius with which Mongols hit Asia and Europe 7 centuries ago. It remains to add that, like the Nazis, the Mongols never learned to adapt Psy-War to peaceful ends. They neither made friends of the conquered populations, nor converted them, nor replaced them. They merely ruled for a few years, and then went back where they came from. The successes and failures of Mongol Psy-War point up the importance of clearly understanding that, even if Psy-War is used efficiently and well before and during the shooting, one must still know how to use it as an implementation for peace. Much of the Psywar of the American Revolution is familiar to all of us, although we have not usually thought of it as such. Davidson has called attention to the extensive use made of Psywar by the colonists in organizing and accomplishing the revolution. They used songs, plays, newspapers, sermons, pamphlets, and periodicals. Even the Declaration of Independence was used, and with remarkable effectiveness, for Psywar. Thomas Paine, the greatest pamphleteer of the American cause, merits careful study as a master of the written word for Psywar purposes. Psychological warfare in modern times. In the 20th century, the process of Psywar remains essentially what it was when Gideon defeated the Midianites. But like many other human enterprises, it has become infinitely more complex. The development of mass communication, broadcasting, worldwide wire news services, mobile printing presses, motion pictures, provides instruments of Psywar previously undreamed of, as may be seen from the scale on which they were used in World War II as compared with previous wars. No one who lived through or read about the collapse of France in 1940 will ever forget the Nazi development of Psywar as a major weapon of attack. The Nazis' use of radio, the press, group meetings abroad, agents, display, fifth column terrorism, and once violence had actually begun, screaming dive bombers, the memory of these is terrifyingly familiar to all of us. The Nazis gave the first full-dress demonstration of what Psywar can accomplish with the new tools of mass communication and the new weapons of military warfare. And once the meaning of what they had done came to be understood, all the major combatants who had not already done so were compelled to institutionalize Psywar in their own arrangements for war. The term psychological warfare came into use in the United States in the early days of World War II, largely to denote certain government-sponsored operations undertaken before Pearl Harbor. It was thought that these operations might meet with greater popular and congressional approval under that name than if they had been given the name that was at that time most common. That is, propaganda. Yes, everyone, the world of psychological warfare is another word for propaganda. The Americans, as violent as ever, can only think of things in terms of violence. The first American peacetime Psywar agency was set up in 1941 by a presidential order, establishing the Office of the Coordinator of Information. The text of the authorizing order makes, curiously, no mention of the dissemination of information. Ostensibly, for political purposes, the COI has been organized to collect information. However, it was understood, though never written down, between the President and William J. Donovan, who became coordinator, that a foreign information service would be established within the COI to beam shortwave broadcasts to foreign countries. As a note on public and official sensitivity to the term propaganda, it is a matter of record that the first official public document using this term did not appear until March of 1943. This was an executive order defining the respective missions of the Office of War Information and the Office of Strategic Services. Since that time, the greater inclusiveness and appropriateness of the term psychological warfare has been clearly recognized, and it is the term commonly used today. It is most likely not the term used in 2025, 70 years later. The common person understands the word propaganda much more readily than they understand the term psychological warfare. A listing of some of the activities, full or part-time, of American Psywar personnel during and since World War II will illustrate how widely inclusive the term has become. American Psywar has been involved not only in radio broadcasts, news releases, and printed publications, but also such activities as the delivery of surrender leaflets by artillery shell and bomb, the delivery of messages by loudspeaker to enemy troops, the V for Victory campaign, the sonic deception cover plan for the Normandy invasion, the making of documentary films and their exhibition on mobile projection units to liberated peoples, the exchange of students and professors with foreign countries, the erection of dummy guns and vehicles to confuse enemy air reconnaissance, and the appointment of a lieutenant general to command an invasion force made up of decoy stockpiles and false radio signals. This last activity is such an interesting example of Psy-War deception that the story deserves telling again. When Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair was brought to England in 1944, it was planned to make the Germans think he had been appointed to command an invasion base. They were allowed to hear radio messages to and from the supposed base and to observe what looked like Allied efforts to conceal its stockpiles from aerial observation. Actually, the base was completely imaginary, merely a part of the cover plan for Overlord, that is, the invasion of Europe. Yet the Germans were so completely deceived by the maneuver that several divisions were withheld from countering the Normandy invasion in order to meet McNair's imaginary army when it should strike. Needless to say, this tour de force of Psy-War contributed greatly to Allied success in holding the beachheads. The tactics of hostile Psy-War may be illustrated from any conflict situation. For example, consider a fight between two schoolboys. They threaten, swagger, and grimace, each in the hope of scaring the other out and thus winning victory without fighting for it. You will notice that even this elementary Psy-War is closely related to direct action. It requires the threat of action before it is effective. If neither boy backs off, the boys may go from the stage of Psy-War to the stage of direct action. This is to say, propaganda without purpose is nothing. Fists fly. Even in the midst of a fistfight, however, Psy-War is part of the conflict. The deft motions of head and shoulders, shifting glances, sidesteps, jabs, and feints are communicating deliberately misleading messages to the opponent with a view to putting him at a disadvantage. Less subtle forms of Psy-War are the taunting words tossed back and forth. Action is used some of the time as a Psy-War symbol rather than for its direct result. One boy eases up, backs up, protects himself. He is trying to communicate a message that he is tired and frightened. The encouraged opponent presses his apparent advantage, rushes in, relaxes his caution. When he leaves a big enough opening, the little psychological warrior suddenly steps forward and swings a punch to his opponent's unprotected nose. There may be yet other psychological operations going on as the two boys pummel each other in the school playground. One boy may be trying to communicate messages to other boys on the lot that will persuade them to accept him as a leader. The other may be trying to impress a girl who has shown signs of liking the curly-headed lad in the front seat. From a schoolyard scrap to the Nazi strategy of terror or the communist propaganda of world revolution is a long step. Yet the principles are the same. Substitute for the boys, nations. For the girl, a neutral nation whose help and friendship are coveted. For the conflict situation in the schoolyard, a conflict of aims, wants, or needs in which the fulfillment of the national policy objectives of two nations are in conflict. In such a situation between nations, as in Newtonian physics, it is impossible for two bodies to occupy the same space at the same time, and so, in one degree or another, there is war. The term Cold War has come into our language as a recognition that war sometimes exists between two nations before the reciprocal application of violence, the classical definition of war, takes place. As von Clausewitz said, war is merely politics continued by other means. Only when it has matured into reciprocal violence is it recognized by a formal declaration of war. And when the shooting war is over, action must still be taken and messages communicated for the purpose of consolidating the victory. Thus, Psy-War may be used in time of peace or time of war. It may be directed at one's enemies or one's friends. It is likely to be used whenever a nation's leaders believe that the communication of express or implied messages will help promote its policies or attain its international objectives. Psychological warfare as communication. 10 years of intensive experience with Psy-War and the history of several thousand years of military campaigns in which, as we have seen, symbolic, that is, message warfare, invariably played a part, give us a body of practical knowledge on the methods, use, and administration of Psy-War. Our knowledge of the theory of Psy-War, however, that is, Our knowledge of the body of principles by which we can predict how a given target in a given situation will respond to a given act of Psywar is derived from the human sciences. Psywar is not a science in the sense, for example, that physics or psychology may be called sciences. It is an application of science with a strong admixture of art. The reason for speaking of it as partly art will be understood if you recollect that a large part of Psywar must be written, or spoken, or designed, or displayed. The reason for speaking of it as an application of science you will grasp at once from what it has in common with another area of military study, namely ballistics. Ballistics is the specialized study of those physical laws that relate to the firing of weapons. It uses the basic physical formulas of mass, gravitation, distance, and velocity to determine the most effective construction and use of guns and projectiles. Ballistics is therefore an application of science. That is, the application of the disciplined knowledge of physics, mathematics, and chemistry to a special area of problems. And just as ballistics depends on the physical sciences, Psywar depends on what we may call the human sciences. The basic process in Psywar is communication. Its basic theory is therefore communication theory. In the last 100 years, the human sciences, notably psychology, sociology, anthropology, and political science, as they have developed and perfected their own central disciplines, have had to give increasing attention to the problem of communication. Education, journalism, advertising, public opinion measurement, human relations, labor relations, military morale studies, and community studies have all served as laboratories for developing a body of theory about communications. Study by study, experiment by experiment, research has analyzed what happens when people communicate with one another, formulated hypotheses about the processes involved, and achieved greater and greater skill in predicting its effects and laying down rules as to how to achieve this effect rather than that one. Increasingly complex experiments with animals and human beings have, over many decades, helped to clarify the relations of stimulus to response that lie at the heart of all communication. A special case of this is the long series of studies of human learning, out of which have come the laws of frequency, reward, readiness, belonging, intensity, primacy and recency, and reinforcement. The systematized knowledge of learning and forgetting curves, and of motivations to learn, and the several systematic theories of learning that seek to combine experimental knowledge into a structure of principles. There have likewise been many studies of the symbols of communications, the meaning of meaning, and the problems involved in communicating symbols from one culture to another or from one person to others. In connection with the growth of the so-called mass media, there have been innumerable studies of communication behavior, which communications the recipients choose to receive out of those communications available to them, and their reasons for choosing them. So, that is to say, please leave a comment to tell me why you chose my video over any other video to have chosen to watch. There's an innumerable amount of videos for you to watch, and I genuinely appreciate that you chose mine. Thank you. There has been a long series of studies of collective behavior, the nature of publics, masses, and crowds, the processes of group consensus, the ways in which new forms of group behavior, new goals, new leaders come into being, and, especially, the kind of group behavior that is associated with social unrest, fear, insecurity, and hostility. Parallel to this have been studies of intergroup conflicts, and especially the position and behavior of minority groups in society. Attempts have been made, especially in military and industrial situations, to analyze the nature of morale and the reasons for high and low morale. In the course of long study of cultural change, researchers have given attention to the question of how attitudes and opinions are formed, how public opinion arises, and how it is changed, and to such manifestations of public opinion as voting behavior. The way rumor operates in a society is another of the numerous communication processes that have been studied at length. Increasing attention has been given to the differences between cultures, particularly the different way things are done, the different values and symbols, and the different group relations that are characteristic of different nations and peoples. Finally, communication channels, attitude formation, group relations, collective behavior, leadership roles, and the other manifestations of communication to and within a society have been examined in their relation to the function of political systems. This, then, is the body of knowledge from which we derive, as well as it can be derived in the present incomplete state of research, a theory of Psywar, and it is this accumulating research that we draw on in Part 2 of this volume. The practice of Psywar is the application of this theory in the light of all available knowledge about policy and objectives, situations, capabilities, and targets. A word of caution is in order at this point. Although research is accumulating very fast in the human sciences, our knowledge of many problems and processes in Psywar is very slender. A student or practitioner of Psywar must therefore be always on the lookout for new findings and always wary of trusting too confidently in old practice. There will doubtless be many important research developments in this field in the next few years. Having reviewed the background of Psywar at some length, we are better prepared to define it. Definitions of psychological warfare. Psychological warfare is sometimes so defined as to imply that it always involves the deliberate use of symbolic communication. The difficulty with any such definition, indeed with most definitions of Psywar, is that it leaves out too many things that are demonstrably the business of psychological warriors, unless we use the term symbolic communication so broadly as to deprive it of its normal meaning. When UN airplanes roared over Korea in the months after the communist invasion of the 25th of June 1950, for example, they must have been recognized, and were intended to be recognized, as tokens of the power and determination of the free world to resist communist aggression. This sentence, in and of itself, is a piece of propaganda intended to play up the might of the American empire. To the extent that they were intended to be so recognized, they were, clearly, intended to communicate a message to occupied South Korea and to the momentarily triumphant invasion forces, and were flying what were, in part at least, Psywar missions. So what they're saying here is that when planes flew over South Korea in 1950, as an act of war, they were also a display of power from America. When one of those planes dropped a bomb on a communist gun emplacement, it was not, of course, waging Psywar against that gun position. It was engaged in direct military action. Again, this goes back to how you may display power, but without the threat of action, it means nothing. The communist soldier who was shot through the head in the course of the attack was not the victim of Psywar, he was the victim of direct military action. But this does not invalidate our point, which is that Psywar must be so defined as to recognize that almost any military action may have a Psywar aspect. A bomb on a gun emplacement may help persuade another gun crew to run or surrender. Machine gun bullets on a communist convoy may help persuade anti-communists in occupied territory to resist. If these things happen incidentally, without being intended by the attackers, they probably should not be called Psywar. But if they are intended to be understood as conveying such and such a message, they are Psywar. The key words in any realistic definition of Psywar would, on the above showing, have to be communication and message. Psywar is the communication of messages, whether expressly or, as in the instances just noted, by implication. A leaflet and a radio broadcast communicate an explicit message. A show of naval force off the coast of a small country which has been remiss about its obligations under national law is an implied message. In each case, the idea is to accomplish something by the means of a message that would otherwise have to be accomplished by the use of force, or not at all. And in each case, the something to be accomplished is behavior on the part of the recipient that, in the communicator's view, will forward his nation's policies or render more probable the achievement of his nation's objectives. There is another pitfall into which we can easily slip when we attempt to define Psywar. We might argue like this. As its very name indicates, psychological warfare is a form of warfare. Nations use it against their enemies, for the purpose of weakening their will to fight and resist. To speak of its use on a friendly country, or to speak of its use in peacetime, is to abuse language. From a strictly dictionary point of view, this may be a sound point. Practically, given certain widely accepted usages of the term psychological warfare, it leads to all manner of nonsense. The Voice of America, for example, is a peacetime agency. Its broadcasts are aimed by no means exclusively at potential enemies. besides which a potential enemy is not an enemy. It often seeks not to destroy, but to build up the will to fight and resist. It thinks of itself as conducting a Psywar operation, and students of Psywar habitually think of it as America's major bet in the Psywar field. Yet a definition based on the line of argument summarized at the beginning of this paragraph would require us to take no notice of VOA's operation in this volume. The reader will have already guessed the general shape of the definition to which we have been leading up. Psychological warfare is the whole range of functions performed by psychological warriors, whether inside or outside duly constituted Psywar agencies. The pilot of a plane flying a Psywar mission is engaged in Psywar and is, for the moment at least, a psychological warrior. It is, admittedly, a circular definition, but it has the advantage of excluding nothing that the psychological warrior ought to think of as part of the overall enterprise in which they are engaged. And it will allow us to give due weight to certain facts that cannot, for the reasons just mentioned, be overlooked in a working definition of Psywar without creating difficulties. We can, for example, bear in mind that the normal end product of any Psywar operation is explicit verbal messages, whether written or spoken, and yet give due weight to the fact that sometimes the messages are implied, as illustrated in the next paragraph. We can bear in mind that Psywar is often waged in peacetime against friends for constructive purposes, and yet give due weight to the fact that one very important type of Psywar is waged in wartime against enemies, mostly by soldiers, not civilians, and for purposes that are destructive or even lethal. The one thing we must be careful to do in using so broad a definition of Psywar is to be clear with ourselves, and with our readers, as to the type of Psywar we are speaking about at each point in our discussion. We have said that Psywar is one of the means nations use to promote their policies and objectives vis-a-vis the outside world. The other means, which we have already noticed in connection with bombing raids, are by no means always easily separable from it. They include things such as war, military aid, blockade, financial aid, diplomacy, and withholding diplomatic recognition. In all these, and we have deliberately moved back and forth between hostile and friendly means, we have forms of action that may or may not have an intended message content, and insofar as they do have a message content, may have a greater or lesser one. We may give economic aid to France because we wish it to be economically strong, or because we think the giving of it will communicate to Frenchmen a message. The United States is rich and generous, and for you not to be its allies would be foolish and ungrateful. The U.S. diplomat abroad may decline an invitation to a cocktail party at the Swiss embassy because he does not wish to encounter the Belgian charge until he has had further word from Washington, or because he wishes to signal a nonverbal message to the Swiss embassy. We dislike certain things you are doing and propose to avoid you until you refrain from them. A good example of an implied message is Operation Magic Carpet. Even when Americans are trying to be helpful, they are no less racist as fuck. Included in the document is an excerpt from Time magazine from 1952. It is titled, Middle East, Airlift for Allah. It reads as follows. The Quran orders all the faithful, except slaves, women without companions, and those who cannot afford the journey, to make the Hajj, the holy pilgrimage to Mecca, at least once in their lifetime. Last fortnight, as the season of the Hajj drew near once again, more Hajis, pilgrims, than ever before, Hajis from Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and most of the desert cities and oases of North Africa, followed the Quran's injunction and swarmed into the Lebanese city of Beirut, the usual way station on the road to Mecca. Each clutched in the voluminous folds of his ihram, the pilgrim sheet-like uniform, an airline ticket to Jeddah, the airport nearest the holy city. There were good reasons for the unusually large turnout. For one thing, the ordained day of the pilgrimage's start this year fell on a Friday, and a pilgrim who makes the Hajj on a Friday, the Muslim Sabbath, is 7 times blessed and sure to achieve heaven. For another, Saudi Arabia's King Ibn Saud, whose oil-rich country includes Mecca, had lifted the usual tax of $52 per pilgrim. Agents of the 3 local airlines began selling tickets to Jeddah like hotcakes. But when the holders turned up in Beirut, they found that there were not nearly enough planes to carry them. The Hajis began piling up in Beirut streets, in the mosques, and at the airport. They didn't complain. They didn't protest. They just waited. Forbidden by Islamic law to wear hats on Hajj, they sat huddled hour after hour under the broiling sun, certain that Allah, in His wisdom, would somehow get them to Mecca. Lebanese peddlers did a land office business selling umbrellas against the fierce heat. "Yallah, Haji! Out of the way, pilgrim!" cried airport attendants. The huddled groups moved aside, returned, and continued to wait. For once on Hajj, no pilgrim ever turns back. Miracle in Washington. On Thursday, with the holy days just a week away, desperate airline officials appealed for help to Harold Minor, able U.S. minister to Lebanon. Minor promptly dashed off a night action, most urgent cable to Washington, pointing out that here was a real chance for the U.S. to make friends in the Arab world. Something of a miracle then happened. The State Department got the point. At Rhein-Main Airport in Wiesbaden, Germany, at Wheelus Field in Tripoli, at Orly Field in Paris, U.S. airmen were suddenly alerted for special duty. 3 days later, the first of 13 huge U.S. C-54s landed at Beirut's airport. Next morning, Operation Hajj was underway. Each clutching a box lunch, bread, olives, cheese, fruit, provided in haste by the American Friends of the Middle East, organized by U.S. columnist Dorothy Thompson, the Hajis were hustled aboard the big planes, 52 a flight. All day long, the transports shuttled back and forth to Jeddah. One old man, deaf and blind at 85, was led aboard a plane by his son. "This is help sent by Allah," the son told the U.S. pilot. "We are linked together today by love and faith." Another passenger on the magic carpet provided by the U.S. was the irascible old Mullah Kashani, Iran's bitterly anti-American religious leader. He rewarded dog-tired pilots Captain Alfred Beasley of Atlanta and Lieutenant Angelo Elmo of Washington with wet kisses on both cheeks. 5 days later, the last of the 3,763 stranded pilgrims was loaded aboard the last flight. The airlift had traveled a total of 121,800 miles. Some of the U.S. airmen had spent 27 out of 40 hours in the air, but the trips had been more than worth it. The Pilgrims' airlift had done more good than any other act of the U.S.'s otherwise fumbling and unimaginative action and inaction in the Middle East. It was the one success U.S. diplomacy could claim in a week of continued crises. The Iranian oil dispute with Britain had dragged on for more than a year, while Iran slid to the edge of bankruptcy, chaos, and communism, hanging on to the cliff like Pauline in her perils. Last week, the US and Britain tried to settle the mess and were flatly turned down by Iran's Mossadegh. See below. It would take a lot before Arabs could forgive the US for its help to Israel, but Operation Magic Carpet might well be the beginning. Speaking for myself and 40 million Arab Muslims, Lebanon's Mufti Alaya told Minister Minor, "I would like to say that this is the turning point of American relations with the Muslim world. This aid has not been to governments, but to people. It is neither military nor economic, but spiritual." Then he issued an unprecedented order. This year, the Hajis were to include the American people, infidels though they are, in their prayers. I'm sure in the preceding 73 years, the relationship between America and the Muslim world has been going very swimmingly, right? We may, in short, think of the means nations use in furthering their objectives as a continuum stretching from direct action without any message content whatsoever to sheer message without any direct action content whatever. In practical terms, one end of the continuum is a punch in the nose. The other is a series of words which seek to accomplish a desired aim without fighting for it. When I say Americans, I mean people like this, people who would lean in a way of thinking the world is, I get my way, or I have to fight you for it. Because that's kind of what this start of the paragraph is implying. The others is a series of words which seek to accomplish a desired aim without fighting for it. My guy, that's just called working together. That's called being nice. That's called collaboration. But here, let me let you in on a little secret. The word collaboration is a communist word. At one end of the continuum is the communist attack on Korea. At the other is communist propaganda about slave labor in the United States. I have to point out again that when we talk about psychological warfare or propaganda, that the sentence I just read is itself a piece of American propaganda. Remember, it's about American superiority. America as a nation doesn't want you to believe that they had ever had slaves. This might seem like a rather modern phenomenon, but I mean, this book was written in 1952. You're only seeing the fruits of that labor now in the modern media. At the extremes, therefore, the two kinds of action are readily distinguishable from one another. In the middle, they are barely distinguishable, and nowhere on the continuum is one kind of means entirely isolated from the other. Communicated by news and rumor, the communist attack on Korea served as powerful psy-war on other populations in Asia. The slave labor line was related to potential revolution in non-communist countries. Terminology of psychological warfare. Some of the vocabulary of psy-war consists of words used in a sense with which you may not be familiar. It may be helpful to be sure you understand such terms as source, target, message, medium, and symbol before going on to part 2 of this volume. The source of psy-war is simply the person or organization that originates the message. Thus, the source of the material on The Voice of America is the government of the United States. The purported source of the material on Nachtsender 1212, a radio station the Allies operated for psy-war purposes during World War II, keeping up the pretense that it was a clandestine station within Germany, was a group of Germans, while its real source was an Allied psy-war operator. The target of psy-war is the individual or group to whom the psy-war message is directed. The target of surrender leaflets may be an opposing enemy unit. The target of Nachtsender 1212 when it broadcasted recipes for cooking waste materials was the German housewife, who, it was hoped, would become furious at the thought of Germans having to serve up and eat such swill. The target may be smaller than the total audience which receives the psy-war material, and the effective target may be smaller still, because some who receive it may turn a deaf ear to it. The message of psy-war is always a symbol or a series of symbols that is to be communicated to the target audience with the intention of inducing a specific and desired reaction that will lead to b, specific and desired behavior on the part of that audience. The message may be as simple as the V sign of World War II or as complex as Wilson's 14 points, which were powerful psy-war in World War I. By a symbol, and we know from the preceding paragraph that most psy-war is symbolic communication, we mean something that substitutes in the communication process for an object, a process, or an idea. Obviously, a dog cannot be communicated, but the idea of a dog can be symbolized by the word dog and communicated readily. Similarly, a Bronx cheer is a symbol of an attitude that can be readily and effectively communicated. A picture of a lake in the woods may serve as a symbol to communicate the nature of a summer vacation. And in this case, literally, a picture would be worth 1,000 words. You will notice an important characteristic of symbols, namely that they always represent the original object, idea, or experience at a high level of abstraction. Or, to put it another way, at a level of reduced cues. All the sensory cues one would get from the object dog, shape, movement, color, sound, smell, touch, etc., are replaced by the single visual stimulus that one gets from seeing the 3 letters D-O-G. This is the quality that makes symbols easy to misinterpret. That is, a symbol can mean to a given individual only what their experience has taught them to connect with it, and no two persons, certainly no two distinct cultural groups, have ever had exactly the same experience. More of that later. By media, we mean the communicative devices for carrying a message from source to target. Among others, they include broadcasts, news, leaflets, the slower printed media, magazines, books, etc., posters, meetings, motion pictures, loudspeaker operations, rumor, agitation, display, and events planned or staged with a view to their psy-war effects. These terms are all common to communication study. Other terms, such as black and white operations, and political, tactical, strategic, and consolidation psy-war, are peculiar to psy-war and will be treated at somewhat greater length in the following sections. Classification of psychological warfare. By mission. The process of psy-war, of course, is a single process. There is no sharp distinction between the basic principles that should govern the conduct of Psywar against enemy troops as contrasted with Psywar against enemy civilians, or as between the principles governing the conduct of peacetime Psywar as contrasted with wartime Psywar. Nevertheless, it is useful, for some purposes, to distinguish between four kinds of Psywar. The fourth, consolidation, is sometimes lumped together with the third, political. Tactical Psywar is directed at specific enemy units in a specific battle situation in the combat zone and is, or should be, integrated into the tactical planning for that situation. Its distinguishing characteristic, then, is its specificity. For whereas strategic and political operations admit a considerable amount of generality both as to target and response, tactical Psywar is just as specific as a bayonet charge or an artillery barrage. Its usual mission is to induce enemy soldiers to surrender, whether individually or collectively, that is, in units. It can also be used, however, to lower the morale or the will of the enemy troops to resist, or to mislead the local enemy command in such a way that they will take some tactical step that, particularly if we are expecting it, we can exploit to our advantage. Tactical Psywar, like strategic Psywar but unlike political, is almost always unfriendly. The exception would be dropping leaflets on the troops of American allies, a regiment of ROKs, for example, that has been surrounded by the enemy and needs encouragement. Strategic Psywar is ordinarily directed behind the lines, either to civilian or to military groups. It is integrated into the overall military plan for the war as a whole, or at least for some important phase of it, a theater, for example, with a view to payoff in the indefinite rather than the immediate future, and on a broad rather than a merely local scale. A typical tactical Psywar operation might be leaflets directed at a unit of enemy troops, urging immediate surrender. A typical strategic Psywar operation might be a series of broadcasts or leaflets dropped on the residents of an industrial section within the enemy's country, in an attempt to cut enemy war production by spreading disaffection among, for example, industrial workers. But no sharp line can be drawn between the two. The leaflets dropped in the enemy's industrial zone might have the further purpose of immediately affecting supplies to a sector of the front where we are about to attack, which would make them partly tactical. The term political Psywar is best reserved for operations that are not integrated into any military plan, although they may, like many broadcasts in recent years from General Headquarters, Far Eastern Command, be conducted by the military. Their purpose, as already indicated, as at least often friendly, to the immediate target anyway, as unfriendly, and they are less likely than tactical or strategic Psywar to call for any specific action by the target audience. Often, they merely attempt to build up desired attitudes on the part of the population of the target country, or this or that political, social, or economic group. Sometimes they attempt to set group against group within the target. Equally well, however, they may attempt to bring about a rapprochement between inimical groups by calling attention, for example, to some alleged common interest that they have hitherto ignored. Much of the Cold War is political Psywar. If it is related to the future military plans of the antagonists, it is not related to them so directly as tactical and strategic Psywar. Typical examples of political Psywar are the broadcasts of the United States and the Soviet nation to the Near East, the Stockholm Peace Petition, the Berlin Blockade, the American information centers throughout the still free countries, the program of exchange of persons between the United States and Europe, and our recently suspended Russian-language America. Consolidation Psywar, which is often and quite legitimately considered a part of political Psywar, is needed when the shooting is over but the victory is not yet consolidated. One of the hard lessons the 20th century has to teach is that military victory does not end a war. Often, it would seem, greater skill is required to win the peace than to win the war. In Japan, since 1945, it has been necessary for the United States to use its Psywar know-how to the full in an attempt to give new direction to the Japanese people's goals and activities. Any future U.S. military victory will impose a similar, perhaps even greater, necessity upon our occupation authorities, probably, though not necessarily, with constructive purposes like those which have governed recent U.S. occupations, and the occupation plans will undoubtedly call for carefully integrated Psywar operations. There indeed lies the best reason for distinguishing between political and consolidation Psywar. The latter, like tactical and strategic Psywar, is part of a military plan. By apparent source. Psywar operations, whether tactical, strategic, political, or consolidation, may be white, gray, or black, depending on the apparent or ostensible source of the messages communicated. White Psywar is overt. Its source is not concealed in any way. Usually, indeed, this type of Psywar emphasizes its source, so that its effectiveness depends in large part on the authority and prestige of that source. The news broadcasts of the BBC during World War II are an excellent example of white operations. At the outbreak of hostilities, the BBC had a long-standing reputation for objective and truthful newscasts. During the war, it made every opportunity to capitalize on this reputation by maintaining the same program formats, call letters, and identifications, and took pains to call attention to itself as the originator of the news, commentary, and entertainment it carried. Surrender passes are another classical example of white operations. In the European theater of World War II, surrender passes were printed with a handsome banknote type of border, the great seals of Allied nations were handsomely displayed, the signatures of the commanding generals were shown, all to make the passes look like official documents, backed up by the Allied governments, and cause the enemy troops to feel that they were certain to be honored by Allied soldiers. Were they? Were the surrender passes honored? Now that's a fucking question. If you'd like to do more reading about these surrender leaflets, I'm actually going to be including a link to an article written about this. It's actually quite interesting. I got distracted and I'm reading it now instead of, finishing my work. So back to the reading, okay? Loudspeaker operations against enemy units are an example of white tactical Psywar. The use made of President Roosevelt's speeches, particularly the Four Freedoms speech, in World War II was white Psywar in its purest form. These speeches were communicated to the enemy audience by every available medium, from radio broadcasts to leaflets to phonograph records, as pronouncements by the President of the United States in an attempt to capitalize on his popularity and prestige. Black Psywar operations are covert operations. The intention of such operations is to pass off the material communicated as messages from some source other than the true one. Since its true source is not revealed, Black Psywar can do things that White Psywar could not possibly do without injuring the sender's cause. For example, here is a leaflet that was distributed among American troops on the Western Front, with the typical errors. Military authorities demand a nationwide war on vice. They got a sham battle. A polite blood testing campaign which would not alarm ladies in societies and parent-teacher associations. Nevertheless, police raided a large number of cabarets, dance halls, and joints in 21 small, medium, and large cities. These raids showed that out of the 20,000 women investigated, a staggering proportion had venereal diseases. Over 80% had VD. 21% were prostitutes. Of the 79 non-professionals, 61% were pickups, 18% were girlfriends, 17% were girls under 20 years, 84% were wives of men serving in the armed forces abroad. Both groups were mostly members of the growing band of V-Girls, who declare that they feel a patriotic compulsion to console troops. Is your girl among them? You can't talk VD out of existence. It is there. The original leaflet can be seen on page 136 of the book written by Paul Leinbarger, titled Psychological Warfare. There's a lot of books about this stuff. It's really cool. The real source of this leaflet was a German propaganda unit, but the pretended source was the US Army. The leaflet had nothing to do with stopping VD among troops. Its real purpose was to lower morale among American troops. A classical example of Black Psywar on the air was Operation Annie. The following brief account of its activities is by H. Berger. Somewhere in Luxembourg, in a secluded house which once belonged to the Gestapo, the American 12th Army Group had installed a small group of men, writers, experts, speakers, and radio technicians. They formed the staff of the Nachtsender 1212, night radio station 1212. Their task was to win the enemy's confidence, to gain the reputation of being a reliable and necessary source by giving absolutely correct information about the military situation at the front. In the course of events, Annie became quite a girl. Slowly but surely, her personality developed. She was thoroughly feminine. In innocent tones, she would speak about the fact that the Reich's Cartographical Institute was short of maps numbered 315 to 318, which were badly needed for national defense. And suddenly you would, if you were German, find yourself asking why the Institute was asking for maps of Westphalia, still more than 300 miles inside the Reich. Then again, she would turn into a good housewife and advise you on the use of the oddest waste material for cooking and eating, and you would wind up by asking yourself furiously, if you were a German, why you should be forced to eat such swill. A set of party directories and phone books captured near Trier provided the writers with the material for a very successful stunt. Late one evening, a small town was captured near Gladbach-Rath, an important party stronghold. At that time, the capture was known to Annie only. At 2:30 a.m., 1212 came in with a flash, a call for help by the party headquarters of the town already in our hands. All listeners in Gladbach-Rath were requested to call party headquarters or all known party functionaries. Phone numbers and addresses were given, and urged them immediately to dispatch 5 trucks manned by reliable party men to rescue their comrades and important party documents. They were to proceed along a prescribed route. Only Annie knew that this route was already controlled by American troops. That night, the Gladbach-Rath local of the Nazi Party lost 5 precious trucks and 5 good drivers. The features had a widely varying character. Sometimes they were eyewitness reports, breathless stories by getaway men. Sometimes they were general observations on the course of the war, never pro-party, but always pro-German. They were pieces full of worry, skepticism, full of ifs and buts, very much the sort of pieces a German military critic would write about the failures, the blunders, and the drab consequences. But 1212 never sneered, was never sarcastic. It was always desperately and sadly honest about every lost position, every lost division, and ultimately, the lost war. The term gray is used to refer to covert operations in which the recipient is not told the source. The sender conceals his own identity, but does not hang what he is sending on anybody else in particular. In this area fall the propaganda of rumor, news credited to usually reliable sources, high military circles, it is said that, etc. The Germans, during the Nazi occupation of France, for example, ran several magazines and newspapers in Paris. They did not describe themselves as German-controlled, and often took the French side of an argument, but they proved to be convenient channels through which to communicate the German propaganda line when necessary. Again, for example, unsigned leaflets, which theoretically might have been prepared either by the enemy or by dissident elements within the ranks of the receiving audience, are gray propaganda. Thus we see that the distinction between gray and black is not so sharp as that between black and white. Gray is perhaps best regarded as one form of black Psywar. If a theme or an idea that white is trying to get across can be echoed or reinforced or corroborated by genuinely deceptive black or gray, the target audience is more likely to give it credit. Thus, a judicious combination of white and black is sometimes very effective. However, for reasons we shall see below, use of this procedure calls for great caution on the part of the sender. Relation of psychological warfare to policy and command. This brief survey of what Psywar is would be incomplete without a further word considering the relation of Psywar to national policy of all kinds: military, political, economic, etc. Psywar is always a means to some end set by policy, and we shall think more clearly about it if we conceive of the ends always being set not by psychological warriors but by another group of people altogether, namely, the policymakers. Skillful Psywar, on that showing, is Psywar that takes the policies laid down by the policymakers and does the best possible job of implementing them by messages to the target audiences. This point is worth emphasizing because endless confusion results whenever it is ignored, as it is when, for example, people blame the unpopularity of the Nazis in the German-occupied portions of Russia in World War II on bad Psywar, when they mean merely that the Nazis and their policies displeased the Russians. The policies that it is Psywar's task to implement may be good or bad, wise or unwise, calculated to please the target or displease it, consistent or conflicting, stable or shifting. Psywar's job is to take them and do the best it can with them. The fact that Psywar personnel often do make policy, especially in the absence of directives from higher authorities, is beside the point. The fact that a surgeon often drives his own car does not abolish the distinction between surgery and chauffeuring. One reason that confusion of the kind noted above, for example blaming Nazi Psywar for decision made by Nazi policymakers, makes the relation between Psywar and policy one of the most complicated and tricky parts of Psywar theory is this. Psywar personnel are, or should be, the personnel best qualified to say in advance what the Psywar consequences of a proposal will be, or what the Psywar consequences of a current policy actually are. Giving expert advice on these points is, in that sense, a Psywar function, whether the policymakers ask for it or not, or, having asked for it, use it or do not use it. Policy, in other words, has a Psywar aspect, just as it has an economic and/or fiscal aspect, about which the policymakers are wise to consult their economic advisors. A nation is, moreover, in a bad way if the predictable Psywar consequences of a policy are not taken into account before it is adopted. It is also in a bad way if Psywar personnel are not in a position to inform the policymakers as to what policies would predictably produce the most favorable Psywar consequences. But the real policy decisions, the decision, for example, as to whether to adopt a policy despite its probable psychological impact on Psywar's target audiences, are under our system a political function that belongs to elected officials and their immediate appointees. When a nation sets about activating policy, obviously the first requirement is intelligence regarding the target. A planner must know what are the given conditions that he must modify in the direction of policy goals. Psywar, like military action and all the other instruments of policy, must therefore work in the closest possible cooperation with intelligence. When policy has specified the desired goals and intelligence has appraised the existing situation, then a nation's Psywar group is ready to go into action. Its Psywar group must, of course, function in close coordination with the other striking arms of policy, the military, the foreign service, etc. Bold words alone, without the Nazi forces behind them, would never have made a strategy of terror. Clearly no Psywar, no matter how skillful, from the Western Allies could have counted on completely to predetermine the actions of the Soviet Politburo. Although Psywar coordinated with NATO, economic measures, and diplomatic policy unity may accomplish something toward that end, no Psywar without supporting military power could by itself have secured the surrender of Japanese troops on Pacific Islands. It is in the area of the crucial margin that Psywar is likely to be effective. If Psywar could not by itself beat the Nazis, it could still deceive 3 German divisions and thus make the beachhead invasion easier. If Psywar by itself could not defeat the Trojans, it could at least get the Greek army into a position to do so. In this marginal area, Psywar can often tip the scales between failure and accomplishment, opposition and cooperation, reconstruction and chaos. The distinction between policy and Psywar emerges as all the more important when we ask, how does one evaluate a Psywar operation? Like all other instruments of policy, it must be evaluated in terms of its effectiveness in furthering a predetermined policy. A military campaign, an economic boycott, or a treaty is good if it advances policy, bad if it does not. No matter how brilliant the strategy, how airtight the boycott, how skillful the negotiations, still the instruments fail if they do not move towards the desired goals. So it is with Psywar. No matter how attractive the leaflet, how scintillating the radio program, such as my great little voice, make sure to like the video, how large the parade, how widespread the rumor, it is good Psywar only if it shows maximum possible results in modifying the behavior of its targets in the direction of policy goals. There is no other test, and if we confuse policy and Psywar, we are left with no test at all. Summary. Psywar has been used with considerable effect since at least the beginning of recorded history. Perhaps modern Psywar operations were developed during World War I. However, the pace and scope have increased greatly since those days. From more or less optional use by amateurs, some talented, others less so, The world has progressed to a state in which self-preservation alone demands the most intense Psywar pressure that a large body of trained professionals commanding immense resources can bring to bear. Unfortunately, for the efficient performance of this task, important knowledge of the theory of Psywar is almost entirely lacking. Applications of existing knowledge have been fairly well recorded, but relatively little effort has been made to find answers to numerous fundamental questions, and consequently the questions go unanswered or are answered provisionally by guesses. You should remember that Psywar is basically communication. Consequently, communication theory is all we have on which to build Psywar theory. It follows then that Psywar may be defined as communication of a message, which may be explicit or implied, in order to bring about some action. Considered more broadly, Psywar may be defined as the whole range of functions performed by psychological warriors. You should remember that Psywar may also be friendly rather than hostile, despite the contradiction in terms. Besides communication of the message, Psywar operators are concerned with the source, target, medium, and symbols. Psywar may be classified first by mission, and then subclassified by apparent source. According to its mission, Psywar is said to be tactical, strategic, political, or consolidation. Any of these may be further subdivided into white, black, or gray Psywar. Finally, you should understand clearly, and never forget that Psywar operators do not make policy. The mission of Psywar is to carry out the policies formulated by the policymakers. This concludes Part 1 of The Nature of Psychological Warfare. All noted references and additional reading will be linked in the description below. Thank you for your time, and I hope you have a nice day.